Hey, thanks for joining me. My name's Noel. I'll do another segment on synergetics and nuclear structure. Today I'm going to explain how the proton can transition into a neutron simply by the addition of one electron. This is what nuclear physicists used to think was happening. We had an electron with an electric charge, and we had a proton with a positive charge, and we had a neutron with a neutral charge, and we thought that the proton was in some way absorbing an electron in order to become a neutron. But the math didn't work out, because the mass of the proton is 1836 compared to the mass of the electron is 1. The mass of the neutron is 1838.5. These are approximates, compared to the mass of the electron is 1. So the scientists started saying, well, if you add one electron to the proton, that equals 1837. Where's the other 1.5 amount of mass which we need in order to make up for that lost mass? And so they developed positrons, electron neutrinos, and electron antineutrinos to explain this. I'm going to explain why we don't need these other particles in order to understand where that extra volume or mass went during the transition phasing when the proton absorbs an electron and transition phases into a neutron. Bucky said that this may come to be identified as a unified field, his system of synergetics. He says, as an operationally transformable complex, can be conceptualized only in this equilibrious state. So we're studying things in the static model state. I'm going to start at the beginning, and I'm going to remind everybody. So, some things that I've gone over in some other videos. So if this is the first time you're tuning in, hopefully that'll give you a good understanding of the whole system. In synergetics, the base unit of measurement is the prime vector. A vector represents mass times velocity going in a particular direction. In synergetics, closest packing unit radius spheres is a model which we use to explain things. The center of volume of one closest packed unit radius sphere, or atom, connected to the center of volume of the closest packed sphere next to it, is the measurement of one vector. So a vector unit length reaches between the center of volume of one closest packed unit radius spherical energy center, or atom, and the other center of volume. It's one vector. Now, vectors represent energy forces of a given magnitude operating at given angles upon given entities at given locations on these entities. For instance, the toothpick in my system is modeling a vector. The spheres are modeling tension. Keep in mind that they can transform themselves back and forth. If you take away all of the vectors, the models still maintain their shape. If you take away all of the spheres, the models still maintain their shape, replacing each vertex with a little bit of tension, like gravity, maintains the structure. We can see how this tensional field, with a mass represented by a ball, shows us how mass has gravity. It's very interesting. So what I want to show you today, first of all, is the transition phasing, which occurs when these polyhedrons shift phase their vectors and transform into other polyhedrons. I have the cube here and the vector equilibrium here. I'm showing you then how when this vector flip phases 90 degrees and all of these cubes vectors shift phase 90 degrees, the spheres disappear and become spaces, and the vectors reconnect where there used to be spaces to become spheres where they interconnect again. Notice then this one shifts phase here, and there's a point here and a point here, and this one shifts phase here and connects here to here, just as in this model. The internal vectors also shift phase 90 degrees when this point of this vector comes out to here and this point goes into there, just as we see here. These shift phase in different ways then. This also explains the particle to wave paradox and shows a model which we can understand. When this particle disappears, it becomes a space or a wave. When this wave disappears during the transformation phasing of the spinning vectors, the wave turns into a particle. So the wave to particle duality is only a part of our lack of understanding, because these things are all happening at close to the speed of light, these transition phasings. I'm going to show you some more models at transition phase. Before I do then, I forgot. So when you press in the 8 vertexes of the cube and you pull out its 6 faces, these become the 14 vertexes of the rhombic dodecahedron. So we shift phase from the cube to the rhombic dodecahedron, from the cube to the vector equilibrium, and I'll show you some more now. If you take these 6 vectors, or interconnections between the 4 vertexes of this tetrahedron, and you shift phase each one 45 degrees, they become parallel. Shift phase 45 degrees, shift phase 45 degrees, and they become parallel. And what happens then is that they become these 6 parallel, 3 sets of 2 parallel, in the tensegridy icosahedron. So once again, when these vectors shift phase 45 degrees, it becomes the tensegridy icosahedron. When you take, notice how I've got this red tetrahedron here, put it up on its side, just like I have this tetrahedron on its side, and you can see, if we just have the red tetrahedron, when these vectors shift phase 90 degrees this way, it becomes the blue tetrahedron. When all the red vectors shift phase, it becomes the blue tetrahedron. Imagine in your mind now a spin complex wherein we just have the red tetrahedron, and the red tetrahedron shift phases to here, and then it shift phases back, and then it shift phases here, and it continues to do that. You'll see the structure of the cube during that shift phasing momentum. This is called the jitterbug transformation model. Bucky discovered this. It is the external shape of the vector equilibrium, which is also called the cubo-octahedron. Turn it up face-wise so it's easier for you to see. So the vector equilibrium's external structure then creates a transformation property. There are other shapes that create transformation properties similar to this one. This is the only one I'm going to show you today, though. This shifts from the vector equilibrium into the icosahedron, down into the octahedron, and then back again. So it continues to pump shift phase back and forth. Octahedron to vector equilibrium and back again. Sorry, it's not working real well. When it's in the octahedral form, it shift phases down into 2 volume tetrahedron. Sorry, you guys. Please pay attention, you're going to be happy at the end. To 1 tetrahedron. So the tetrahedron shift phases out to the octahedron. These shift phasings are interesting to understand because there are numerical equivalencies. Before I explain a little bit about that, I might as well go into a little bit about how string theory misconceptualizes and thinks there's 11 dimensions. Let me explain the 11 dimensions real quick. They think that 7 of these dimensions are wrapped up inside of the regular 3 dimensions or the 4-dimensional space-time continuum. The vector, which is the prime unit of measurement in synergetics, already has mass times length times height. It's already 3-dimensional. When it begins its movement property in a linear direction, this mass is now into a 4th dimension. I'm just speaking theoretically. When it moves out to a planar field, it's the 5th dimension. Up to a volumetric field, it's the 6th dimension, but it's still just an empty shell. It's an energetic embracement field. It's a volumetric containment field. These words are important for us to understand because they work better than the words that we currently use. It's not just volume, it's a volumetric containment field. So the energetic containment field, the energetic embracement field, is a hollow thing at the 6th dimensional level. Density, filling it with internal structure, like our tetrahedron here, creates density, and that's the 7th dimension. So these 7 dimensions seem to be all bound up within the regular space-time dimension of 4 dimensions. Your 7 dimensions plus your 4 are your 11 dimensions of string theory. I'm going to move over to the other board now and explain then where this mass is being lost. I've spoken about this before in some of my other lectures. The universe is setting up a dynamic within its six-axis metric. You have this vector equilibrium here, which has square faces, and I hope you can see it, the square internal structure. Let me see behind you here. You've got squares on the inside and squares on the outside. You have triangles and you have hexagons. The hexagon running through the center and the square running through the center are running on different planes or different angles. Within the vector equilibrium 17 frequency, the closest packed unit radius spheres within the hexagonal array contain 919. This is 918 around 1. The squares planes within the vector equilibrium have 613 spheres closest packed. That's 612 around 1. The interactive dynamics of this moving system are such that either the 919 can be using that central ball at one time, or the 613 can be using that ball at one time. When the 919 is not using it, it's ratioing 918. There are four planes of hexagons, four hexagonal planes in the vector equilibrium. 918 times 2 is 1836. So you've got two protons. You've also got 919 times 2 is 1838. When the 919 is using the ball, the 613 can't use it. The square can't use it because the hexagon's using it. So I have 612 balls on 3 planes times 2 directions. That means I've got 1836 ratioing with 1839. This is creating an interesting intermixing when only one of the planes can use the central sphere. It's creating a matrix where we've got 1836 times 4 ratioing with 1838.5 times 4. Because the 1838 and the 1839 are ratioing at an average of 1838.5. And this shows how when you take one ball, that's one mass, like an electron, and you shift it from the 1836 to the 1838.5, within this dynamic structure, it changes the mass 2.5 because of the way it's being used, not because of imaginary particles like positrons and electron neutrinos and anti-electron neutrinos. This is one model which shows how, when we transfer one electron sphere from the proton to the neutron, why it changes 2.5 of the mass of the electron. Very easy to understand when you have the road map, right? So we've got a map here. This truly is the unified field, and that's what Bucky called it. So another example then, but before I get to the other example, I want to explain a little bit. We just went over how the shift phasing occurs within the polyhedron structures as the vectors change either 45 degrees or 90 degrees or continue in their spin 180 to 360 to 720, changing shape. What's important in Arthur Young's The Reflexive Universe, his theory, he says it's important to understand that when angular momentum changes, it's the shape that changes and not necessarily the energy. Some of these polyhedrons, when they shift phase, like the cube to the rhombic dodecahedron, have different external shape but the same number of volume. Some, like when the cubes transition phases to the vector equilibrium, will shift phase their shape and add or lose volume. Loses 4 volume from the cube to the vector equilibrium. Now, I'm drawing an analogy. When we spin the tetrahedron 6 vectors 45 degrees, it creates the tensegrity icosahedron. When we spin shift those same 6 vectors 90 degrees, and then shift them again and shift them again, and keep shifting them, it creates that cube. When we shift the vectors, the 24 external vectors of the vector equilibrium 45 degrees, we create the rhombic dodecahedron. when we shift phase all 36 of them, internal and internal and external, 90 degrees, we shift phase them into the Q. So I spoke in the past about my 0 points. These are the places where the total number of energy vectors in these different polyhedrons can be broken up into the total number of masses between the electron, the neutron, and the proton in whole rational units, ratioing with Planck's constant and the fine structure constant in whole rational units, using only basic mathematics. So if you recall then, the total number of energy vectors connecting or creating structure in the tetrahedron, there's 9,384 times 274. That creates a structure in the 136 frequency tetrahedron. The same between this number and that number, and multiply this number to that number. That's the total number of vectors. Remember what vectors are. Vectors represent energy forces of given magnitude operating at given angles upon given entities at given locations on those entities, right? So we've got all these vectors operating at different locations on these different entities at various angles. Remember, vectors never come singly. They only come as the full family of forces operating in any physical circumstance. See how these 36 are operating in a physical circumstance to create structure? So the structure within the nucleus of the atom is created by these stable structures which can also maintain a speed of light or whatever speed they need to between these vector dynamics. I showed in my other video then how the torus occurs when this vector shift phases down to this vector and continues shift phasing down to this vector. This end creates a 120 degree angular variation around the outside, and this one creates a 180 or half spin down shift. So there's our half spin shift and our 1/3 shift. No other model known to do this. So you'll see how from the outside it goes through the center. This creates our torus. When all 36 of these vectors are moving in concert, they're never touching each other or hurting each other or harming each other or stopping each other from moving on their way. When this one shift phased to here, this one's already shift phasing down to here. I hope I'm holding this right so you guys can see it. So what happens then is this creates toroidal movement, whereas this shifts through the center and around the outside. Then this right here instantly starts shifting through the center and around the outside. So you have angular momentum and linear momentum. Bucky mentions that Synergetics is capable of expressing linear and angular momentums in universe. So when we shift the 6 vectors 45 degrees from the tetrahedron, we get the icosahedron. When we shift phase the alpha 0 point by 45 degrees, or multiply it by 45, it becomes the pen 0 point, the proton, electron, neutron 0 point. So we have shift phasing in 45 degrees. If we take that 9384 and multiply it by 720 degrees, which is the total number of angular variation on the surface of the tetrahedron, we get the 5th 0 point of the pen scale, 6756480. And here's where it's important for us to understand some things. I'm going to go ahead and move on to this next thing because I want you guys to kind of see. So, when we have these 0 points ratioing, we have, for instance, the second 0 point of the quanta scale is 1838.5, that's the neutron, times 2 to the second power minus 1, the electron. 2 neutrons is signifying 2 helium, or excuse me, helium-2, a helium-2 atom. I also have 2 protons in here, 9384 times 720 times 2. Remember how these are ratioing? This is ratioing so that when I divide my second 0 point by my 6th 0 point of the pen scale, I get the atomic mass unit of the electron, 0.000545. So here's a second model which explains why we don't need to make up positrons or antineutrinos or neutrinos to understand why the shift phasing between proton and neutron shift phases by only 1 electron's atomic mass unit. Does that make sense? It's really important to understand. Now keep in mind that when you take this quanta 0 point, the second, when you divide it by the total number of angular variation within the external surface area of the tetrahedron, which is 720, The inverse of the second root of the second 0 point of the quantity scale divided by 720 is equal to the fine structure constant correct out to 6 decimal places, 0.007297. So what I'm speaking of are things which can't be considered coincidences. There's just too much going on here. You'll notice that the beginning of my quantiscale 0 point is based off of 3677 frequency tetrahedron. That's real close to the deuteron's weight or mass. The deuteron is a hydrogen atom which has a neutron in it. There's only 0.00015% of the hydrogen in the universe is containing a neutron and called the deuteron. What I'm pointing out is it's very close. So we've got different things showing up here, right? We've got deuterons, we've got protons and electrons, we've got helium-2 here, we've got helium-4 here, 4 protons and 4 neutrons. What I'm doing then is I'm expressing to you folks the knowledge that the 6-axis metric of the isotropic vector matrix creates a system of measurement which is able to ratio the proton, the neutron, and electron in whole rational units along with Planck's constant and the fine structure constant using only basic mathematics and solving all the mysteries so that we understand now where the supposed hidden mass went and we don't have to make up positrons, neutrinos, and antineutrinos. There's a lot I want to talk about, and so I'm going to move on over to my other chart here. And let's see if we can get this in real well. I'm just going to leave it on the floor, I think. Well, that's not bad. How's that, you guys? Okay. Pretty good? Go back one. Okay, thanks for paying attention. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being very patient. First, I'm just going to explain something real quick, okay? When we see this wave on our oscilloscope, we see it as a two-dimensional line, right? And we don't understand that it's really a spiralinear wave which is occurring. It's occurring like this. It's a spiralinear wave linear event trajectory. So it's easier to see it if you're looking at it with a model. So the energy is really going like this, right? And it's going around the vector equilibrium in such a way that when it hits the next closest packed unit radius spherical, transfers its energy. So we have transfer of energy to transfer of energy to transfer of energy. So, read just real quick from Bucky. Synergetics is the first system to introduce the time dimension integrally as the frequency of systems, which initially are metaphysically independent of time and size, but when physically realized have both time and size, which are identified in Synergetics as the frequency of the system, the modular subdividing of the primitive metaphysical timeless system. You cannot have time without growability, which implicitly has a nucleus from which to grow. We would not have discovered the frequency or time dimensions had we not explored the expansiveness, contractiveness, and radiational gravitational behavior of nuclei in pure metaphysical, sizeless, and timeless principle. It follows that the isotropic vector matrix field discovery represents the frame of reference through which all the interpulsating transformations of time realizations transit, but which will never be directly witnessable in the eternally instant static state. So we're witnessing this stuff in the static state, we're conceptualizing it, and we're talking about it. I want to remind you guys about constant volume. He has a model here which is showing then that this volume of the A quantum module is identical to the volume of the B, the C, and the D quantum modules. When you take this as a slide rule and slide it up, this edge length of the tetrahedron, you can slide it to infinity and it will resemble a line, but it will still have the same volume. Another way to understand this too then is, oh, I blew up my tetrahedron. When you have a tetrahedron and you take the tip of the tetrahedron and you move it just gently along that same plane, it'll maintain the same volume. And that happens out to infinity. See, I'm trying to explain here about synergetics, studies things pre-time and pre-size. When you add time, which is frequency, you understand that time coordinates frequency interference patterning and phase transitioning. If I've got approximately 8.655 times 10 to the 22 cycles per second at this approximate wavelength, and I'm interpatterning these frequencies at the time of coupling with this amplitude, as I was mentioning in my last video, I believe that's how we're going to begin understanding how to create protons and neutrons and combinations of them through frequency interference patterning, as I was explaining in my last video. I wrote something up here I want to explain real quick. Energy equals Planck's constant times the frequency minus P. P is the resistance of the material being acted upon. Physicists don't use this because this is mechanical and electrical engineering work. Okay? So what I'm trying to explain then is that there are a couple of formulas that I noticed in some of the books that the physicists are using, and they're equating things what they shouldn't be equating. I just want to point out one more incorrect thing you guys are thinking about when you're doing this. So I've got E equals mc to the second power. Now I've seen in books where physicists are saying, give me a second, I'm sorry guys. Since E equals hv, hv equals mc squared. These are different considerations. I hope you guys can see this. Energy is equal to mass times the velocity of light to the second power is an equation which is explaining exactly how much energy exists within a certain mass. And it becomes realized when we blow up that mass like plutonium, and it creates incredible amounts of destructive energy. This formula, E equals Planck's constant times the frequency, is a different measurement of energy. This is measuring the amount of energy that is coupling with matter. And this is a very, very, very small amount of energy. The energy needed in order to transition phase an electron from one discrete state to another is very small. So when you're saying that Planck's constant times the frequency is equal to mass times the velocity of light squared, you're misconceptualizing what we are trying to understand, and you're creating more confusion for the young people who are coming into this field who are already confused enough because we have so many paradoxes which we're trying to understand. We need to understand, remember, time is not a dimension other than all dimensioning occurs in time. Time is a tool which the mind uses in order to categorize and coordinate all of its linearly aggregated experiences. And that's why time works properly in all of our formulas to explain then the phase transitioning. Remember, Eddington speaks of the phase dimension. And then we went off track by trying to understand how, we can use different dimensions in our mathematical models in order to simplify the equations, but we're not simplifying anything when we create more paradoxes. I'm not sure if I had the camera close enough for you guys to see everything here. I have other videos that I've been showing. I hope you guys are understanding everything. There are no big paradoxes. There's only a confusion about what's happening. I want to remind everybody that the fine structure constant and the amplitude at which an electron absorbs a photon is related to the 0 point of my quanta scale. The inverse of the fourth root of the quanta point divided by 360 is the amplitude, right? And that relates to the fine structure constant. I appreciate you guys tuning in with me. If you give me a second, I'm going to actually look at my notes and see if I was trying to go over something else. No, went over the 2.5, blah, blah, blah. I went over the 7 dimensions, right? No, it's fun talking to you guys. Hope you're enjoying. It's really easy to understand when you just understand that the prime vector is the base unit of measurement in our system. That's the base quantum of energy. I'll be tuning in again with you. If you've watched this whole video, I appreciate it. Please send it to some physicists or some people who are interested. I'd like for everybody to understand this information. Keep in mind then that when we have these ratios, like the ratio between the quantiscale divided by the Penn scale, that turns up with this 000545 number, and we multiply that by 938.4, the proton's MeV, we get the electron's MeV, 0.511. I can go over this all day long. I've got many lectures for you so far. I think I've got 4 hours of lectures. This should be my 14th lecture. Please tune in again, you guys. I hope that this is making sense. Bye now.